Welcome to our first panel of the day, From Vision to the New Age Digital Governance. By now, you have already heard about the digital agenda of Estonia for the next few years. And to recap, the three main directions that Estonia is taking is firstly, providing proactive services, one of which you already met, Bürokrat. Secondly, combining cyber strategy to the digital agenda, which is today, knowing the events we are seeing right now, not only a necessity, but a must. And thirdly, going green. I hope that it's no longer just a buzzword, but both the private and the public sector are actually taking actions on this matter. Now, before I go on, I think it's time to meet our guest speakers in this panel. I'm honored to share the stage with Chief Information Officer of Estonia, Luukas Ilves. And online, we have Mr. Neil Warsop, the Deputy Director at the Government Digital Service from the UK, and Aaron Meniem, the Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Communications and Information of Singapore. Quick note, going forward, we will address each other with first names. We have agreed on this beforehand. Thank you all for joining us. I would actually like to start with a question to both Neil and Aaron, since we already had an overview of the digital agenda of Estonia. Very briefly, can you describe and give us an overview of your country's strategies for the next few years? And what are the main transformation aspects going forward? Neil, let's start with you.
Thanks, Arets. Okay, at GDS, our mission is to build a simple, joined up and personalised experience of government for everyone. Using our unique position at the centre of government, we'll develop services that work better for the user. We actually have 5 missions, and I'll just describe these briefly for you. The first is gov.uk, making that single and trusted online destination for government information and services. And second is having joined up services that solve whole problems and span multiple departments. Some people only need to access government services a few times per year. However, there are millions of people who have complicated and busy lives and need lots of help from government. For these users, our services appear tremendously siloed and difficult to navigate. So to fix this, we'll build a gov.uk account and create a single sign-on for all services. Our third mission is a simple identity solution that works for everyone. Our fourth mission is creating common tools and expert services. We talked a lot about the UK has our successes in digital transformation from online tax to MOT. However, many citizens experience services that are not quite as good. So we want to fix the long tail and transform the long tail as well. For example, removing PDF forms. We also want to ensure existing platforms are well maintained and that we have capability to support transformation across government. Our last mission, mission 5, is on joined up data across departments.
Thank you. And Neil and Aaron?
All of you. Tallinn is one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. In Singapore, a lot of what we do is not different hugely from what Kaidi and Neil have described. We have what we call the Smart Nation Initiative, which our Prime Minister launched 8 years ago, and he remains one of the biggest champions for digitalization of the economy, of society, and of government. Today, I wanted to talk about 4 big priorities, since you mentioned you'd like to focus on what the core aspects are in our strategy. And I've kind of summarized them in 4 I words, which help us to remember things, I hope. The first I is that we are focused very much on improving lives, right? We're not interested in the adoption of technology for its own sake, but it needs to make a genuine difference in the lives of citizens and businesses and the users of these digital services. And that means we've tried to make sure that the digitalization has been pervasive, right, across things like e-payments, COVID response, smart meters, even our libraries are digitalizing, and making sure that our economy is digitalizing in that process. The way we shop, the way we entertain, the way we work has continually been changing, and we're very keen that these new business and living models continue to evolve. So we're very focused, first of all, on that I of improvement. The second I is infrastructure and the regulation of that infrastructure. We think that is particularly critical because when you have the right regulations in place, that's when you have the right guardrails and enablers to ensure that we can digitalize at the right pace, right? To make sure that we can go fast in order to improve the lives that we're interested in. The same way cars have handbrakes, right? And that friction allows bicycles to move in the best possible way. We want to make sure that digitalization has the right regulations in place to make sure that we take care of digital security, as well as to make sure that we consider the cybersecurity, as well as the broader social security issues that are so necessary in this day and age. We want to take care of issues like online falsehoods, online safety, and ensure that our most vulnerable communities, children, women, are well protected against the online harms that might exist. Another area where we think the right regulations are critical is to have the adequate personal data protection and privacy rules to ensure that we can actually seize the opportunities of digitalization in tandem with our own societal norms and our societal sentiments. The third I is the importance of individuals, right? We think it's really important that there be a continual focus on each individual being part of the digitalization process and that they don't feel alienated. This means that they need to be included and that digital access and inclusion programs are key. It means that people need to be catering to services that are as user-centric as possible so that they all feel part of the digitalization process. And it means building up human capital, right? The skills, the knowledge, the experience that every individual needs to play meaningfully in the digital space, whether they are doing ICT jobs or whether they are doing jobs that contribute using ICT as an enabler and a set of tools. Everybody, we think, needs to be involved as meaningfully as possible in that process. And finally, the fourth I is innovation. We need to be continually evolving and agile so that we keep pace with the ways in which technology is changing and the ways in which the dynamic evolution of the digital space is happening. And we think if we combine these, right, that can focus on improvements, on infrastructure, on individuals, and on innovation, that we'll be able to have a really rich and constantly evolving for the better overall smart nation system.
Perfect. I really like the ambition for the future, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of challenges that we also have to face when we have all those big plans. A question for everyone: what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges ahead of us? I think let's start with Luukas over here.
Thank you, Edith. And Aaron, Neil, good to see you. Good evening, and I guess good afternoon for Neil. I think that there are a couple of places as I'm taking over from my predecessor Siim that I'm looking at where we still have quite a lot of work to do. Estonians like to talk about our interoperability, our electronic identity, the things that we do well around the technology and the infrastructure. But when we look at the user centricity and really the extent to which the way we design services, it is not keeping pace with the way that at least the best parts of the private sector, the most innovative companies, are doing so. I also think we have a lot to learn here from how you, in particular, Neil, at GDS, have done things over the last decade, because you really made user centricity a real focal point. And we've got some places of excellence there, but we need to be more consistent. The second challenge relates to that technological basis, which is legacy. A lot of what we've done is now 20 years old. And the literal technology may not be 20 years old, but the architecture, the design is. And so if we're looking at the future of identity, interoperability, how we access data today, well, data is a good example. Big data 20 years ago was a millionth of what we're talking about today, given the doubling that we've had just about every year in the volumes of data we're processing. And the last challenge is a paradoxical one. Digital as a concept should disappear into the background. And at the end of the day, what should be motivating us are the business goals of government. And those are going to be measured in things like GDP, healthcare, even something as abstract as happiness. And so I think we have to start doing a better job at how we view digitization as a tool that supports the various business goals of government. And we do that well in some places, but in others we have quite a ways to go.
Would you like to add anything to it, Neil or Aaron?
Sure. I agree with a lot of what Luukas has said there. I mean, I think the user need focus in GDS and in the UK has been great, but it's still need to go wider into the rest of government. And as we talk about the long tail here, so service transformation beyond some of the key high-profile services that we've seen improve a lot. We've also got to focus a lot on capability. There's a huge demand for digitally capable people, both in the public and private sector. So recruiting people for government, is always a priority as well. Tackling legacy data, and a specific thing in the UK, creating a single digital identity service is a priority here too.
I think I very much agree with what Luukas and Neil have said. I suspect we're all facing very similar challenges as reasonably similar digitalization systems. I talked about 4 I's in our strategy. When I think about the challenges, the way I think of it and summarize it is in 4 A's. First of all, it's the problem of access. I think we continually will need to be pushing the digitalization agenda, but at the same time ensuring that those who don't have access have other options, right? So how do we ensure that those who need it have, say, paper access, but ensure that that doesn't become a crutch, right? And that is genuinely a last resort for those to use when they need it, but that it doesn't then slow down the overall transformation process. So I think access and the equity of that access will continue to be challenges for all digitalizing systems. I think then encouraging adoption will be critical. There will always be the change management process of dealing with the first 95% who usually come on board relatively quickly. When you pay your taxes fast, that's where you get most of the people. But the last 5% will often involve some amount of resistance and some amount of inertia. So we have to figure out ways to bring that last mile in. And in Singapore, actually, for some of those last miles, the COVID-19 pandemic provided a huge amount of impetus for people to finally, get on board with things like e-commerce and finally learn to use more digital apps so that they could stay in touch with their families, because otherwise there just wasn't that option during the period of what we called our circuit breaker, which is similar to the lockdowns in other parts of the world. The third A is adaptation, right? Once people have adopted, they also need to then think about how their lives are actually going to change and how this is not just the tactical adoption of technology, but people are actually changing the fundamental nature of how we operate. This applies as much to us in government as it applies to everyone else. We have to use technology to think about how we change the nature of our work rather than simply take the old work and transpose it into the digital space. The last thing is what I would call agility, right? The importance of continually transforming ourselves as individuals and the economy and our business models, as well as society at large, to make sure that we keep pace with digital change. And this is where I think some of the talent constraints and the shortages that Neil mentioned become particularly important, because we can only be as agile as each of us is able and skilled to do. And if we don't have that skill base, then actually we will face more challenges in the future.
I heard this word legacy coming out from this discussion now. We have come a long way as countries, and right now the world is seeing us as pioneers and looking at us, what are we doing next? But it wasn't always the case. It all started with a vision. Do you think, or what do you think, how much has the vision itself changed over time? And how do you keep focused and stay innovative? Because I know for a fact that in here at the briefing center, we are always being asked, what's next? And the expectations for the governments are really high. Aaron, Luukas, how would you comment on it? Like, how much has it changed and so on?
Well, I'd say in Estonia's case, at least, expectations are both the biggest driver and the biggest challenge we have. I mean, you saw some of the, in Kaidi's presentation, you saw some of the numbers. The approval numbers, as it were, for our digital government, they're okay, but they're not fantastic. 69% of individual users are happy with services, 47% of businesses. I'm not sure it's because what we do is bad, but it's because we have really high expectations amongst our users. And our users really do look at our government services and they ask, why is this not as good as what my online bank is providing me, as what Apple is providing me? And so that drives us. But it also, sometimes will put us in more of a negative defensive loop where we have to be explaining why one or another sort of system hasn't been updated, is slow. I think keeping up with expectations, once we set those positive expectations, is really valuable. I think there are a lot of countries across the world where you have the opposite problem, which is people basically don't have positive expectations for government. They've kind of resigned themselves to poor digital services in the public sector. But but there's also a risk of those expectations being, too high at times.
What's the case in Singapore? I know that there are similar, different kind of services in place over there, and you're using different solutions. What's the situation over there in your country in terms of vision?
It's a great question, Aret. It's a great question, because I think legacy is something that will always affect systems, right? Clayton Christensen used to write about what he called the innovator's dilemma, right? Where we will always face a situation where after you have succeeded, it becomes much harder to innovate because the costs of innovating are much greater. The costs of abandoning success and changing it are also greater, because if the new experiment happens to fail, then there's a huge criticism that can apply. And we found that at the moment we work from a high base, right? 97% of our pass account, right? So that's a user base of more than 4.4 million users for the core digital service that enables interoperability across different parts of the government. We have a lot of SingPass. We have different methods that allow people to get in if they find that they don't all want to use exactly the same method. We've got the most commonly used, which is the SingPass app. Others prefer to use SMS, one-time passwords. Others people prefer facial verifications. We try and create that variety so that the user experience can be diverse across sure that we are responding to actual user needs rather than what we think are the user needs. And this means having a really radical design approach. It means continually not just thinking about our users, but talking to them, watching their behavior, finding out what is their pain point, what is their pleasure point, and then designing and iterating over and over again in response to those user needs. I find that when we do that, then actually the overall government services can continually respond to what Luukas described, right, as this feedback. But we're not waiting for surveys to give us once a year feedback. We're iterating in real time and finding that as we get enough data, we can keep updating the system. So I think what I would say is that when governments are dealing with legacy, we need to approach that legacy with a very experimental and a prototyping mindset. And the more we can conduct little experiments, get feedback, and adjust what we do in response to that feedback, then the stronger our overall design will be, and the less lengthy the legacy becomes, right? Because we're changing in real time and as we go along. And the more we do that, the more we don't allow for the legacy to set in and become an inertial force in our overall evolution.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's one thing for you to do that, right? And I think the challenge I'm trying to wrap my head around right now is how do I get 12 different departments across government and many agencies to have that mindset shift, right? To go from static measurement to constant A/B testing, even, never mind just sort of keeping ongoing dynamic stats. Have you had any sort of magical tricks or silver bullets to really create that service design mindset shift?
Luukas, I wish there was a silver bullet. If there was, then you and I could try and patent it, right? But unfortunately, there isn't. I think what this really requires is a sense of will, grit, and determination in a system. And one thing we've benefited from is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister is deeply supportive of the Smart Nation process, and that means that there is a certain amount of attention that gets paid to agency's own transformation. What we've also done is identified people who are the strategic leaders of digital transformation in every agency family. We call them chief digital strategy officers, and they're very often the deputy secretary in a ministry that then looks after a cluster of operational agencies, and they are the ones responsible for going around and doing a bit of nagging and saying, we need to digitize this, you've got to use more data here, you've got to iterate this a little bit better, your user experience and this is not particularly great. And so these chief digital strategy officers supervise what we call ministry family digitalization plans, right? And these plans are quite useful because it allows for the different agencies to not just come up with what they want to do over the next 2 or 3 years, but it allows them to share and learn from one another what has worked, what has not worked. So that sense of good or best practice being shared is actually very powerful. We also periodically train all our chief digital strategy officers together in the kinds of work that need to happen. And again, that that conversation that can happen amongst them at the strategic level of what is working versus what is not, then allows them to take back those lessons and in a way stand on the shoulder of giants, right? Because they don't have to repeat the errors that others have done, and they can build from the successes instead.
And I would actually like to turn my next question to Neil, since Estonia and Singapore, we both have very an electronic identity in place for a while now, but I know that in the UK, it's not exactly the case over there. In 2020, UK came out, published their plans about a comprehensive digital ID program over there. What, do you know what's the alternative over there? Because I know that in Estonia, when we have a physical card, it's rather outdated, so it is recommended by the experts to find a more advanced solution. Singapore has a SingPass. What's your goal, and what is the something that you are building over there?
Sure, thanks. I was just thinking about my response to the legacy question, actually. But standards, by the way, is what we've approached with here on that one. So on single identity, yes, the context is different because, as you say, we don't have an ID card. There's been lots of debate over that over the years, probably over decades now. I think the thrust on the digital identity program for us is that we want to build a simple, joined up, personalised experience of government for everyone. And it's a key commitment of our reform agenda now, and it will deliver a better focus, a better outcome for citizens. And we also think that economic benefits of having that digital identity are massive as well. And as in GDS, being in our unique position at the centre of government, we want to develop a service that works for users and service teams across government too. We want to remove unnecessary complexity. We want to make sure we're developing an inclusive and accessible way for people to log on to services. And users who need to prove their identities in order to access these services will be able to use it, including the vulnerable and those without common documents. We've been doing a lot of work and discoveries over the last 7 months or so, and we're combining expertise of people in GDS, but also people in departments. We're going to co-design a solution. We're going to try and build as much of it ourselves as possible, but we're in the process of procuring a partner too. So it's one solution that works for all services, but I think it's difficult at this stage to say exactly what it is. We're still, a long way down the journey through kind of looking at verify solution early on and changing tack to where we are now, but it's difficult to say explicitly what we're doing, but the principles are clear, I think, for us.
It sounds as if all the three countries are actually experimenting a lot, taking risks, because we never know if we are going to have a good or a bad idea, right? I listened to a podcast with Seth Godin over the weekend, and I felt like there was this idea that applied to building a digital governance, because he said that in order to find a good idea, you would have to come up with as many bad ideas as possible. And I find that this is what all of us are doing as well. So what do you think? How much can we risk though? Like, especially, for example, when Singapore and Estonia, we have built this digital society, and we wouldn't want to risk of losing people's trust anymore because we have built it along the way. So has people's risk tolerance changed in time, or?
I can say for a fact, the risk tolerance of the people building government services in Estonia has probably gone down compared to what it was in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I mean, Aaron already talked about the innovator's dilemma, and I think we're very cognizant of the fact that with the same sort of 95% penetration user base we have, that is a really important asset that we can't lose. We don't want people turning away and sort of withdrawing from digital government. And so in some senses, we have to think the same way that very risk-averse regulated industries do, which is that failure isn't an option. And there are some things you can do to mitigate those risks. And probably the biggest one ultimately is transparency. And that includes transparency about your failures. I mean, one of the things we've done when we've had security incidents, when we've really screwed up, is to be very frank and forward about it. And that creates a confidence that if you do have a failure, it's not going to get hidden. Citizens are going to know about it, and that gives you that generally engenders the confidence to basically give you a second chance. And I think that's what we sort of have to deal with. It's ultimately not how do we avoid a failure on a technical level, it's how do we ensure that those technical failures that are inevitable don't become systematic trust failures in the people behind digital government.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, we have run over time right now, but I have one quick question. I would like to have one keyword from each of you. If you could recommend something to those countries who are only in the beginning of this journey, in one word, what would you tell them? What kind of recommendation would you give them? Neil, let's start with you.
User needs, focus. Sorry, not one word.
Aaron?
I would say that it's about people. It's focusing on people to get the right talent, to get the right skills, but then also focusing on people in terms of the users. So people, always about people.
Yeah. Well, since they already took my favorite words, I'll just add one, which is a fifth I, iterate. And if we're going with letters, we could also have the fifth A, which is Aaron, but you know.
Perfect. So now.
And Neil, I'm really not picking on you because Aaron didn't give us 4 N's. If Aaron can give us 4 N's, you can be the 5th.
We still have 5 more minutes though, so that we can also see what are the people asking from our panelists. So there is this one question. How to justify implementing digital infrastructures? Is there a way how governments actually measure the success of or impact of digitalization? And are we only talking about hours or time saved? Hours or finances saved? Or would you bring out some other aspects that are in favor of implementing a digital governance as such? Aaron, sorry, Luukas.
Well, look, our people's time saved and bureaucratic time saved, the money is sort of the obvious measures. I'd say at the end of the day, it's all the business measures of government we're talking about, right? So it depends a bit on the service, but health, wisdom, financial success for businesses, GDP growth. I mean, there's not one metric across all of digital government, but I want the healthcare people to be really maximizing the healthcare metrics, right? I want the people who are running my education system to be maximizing for, well, what's the wisdom and the empathy that they're engendering in our citizenship as we all are educated and so forth. So it's all the KPIs of government, the dozens of them.
Mm-hmm. Neil, Aaron?
I'd love to build on that, actually, Aret. I'll build on that because I agree very much with Luukas. I think we need to focus a lot on the effectiveness of the systems that we have in place. What you call the business goals of government, right, Luukas? I think we're having to build on that. And if we do those better with digitalization, then that is a mark of digitalization being successful. So we need to get better at measuring ourselves according to the standards that we have set. I would add to that 2 other things. One, we need to measure usage and usability of all of our digital services. And that means knowing that the stuff we put out there is not just hypothetical in the benefits it's creating, but is actually doing genuine things to go back to the users, right, and designing for them, as Neil pointed out. And then the third thing, which is really not sexy, but super important, is data security. Right? We need to make sure that the data, as well as the security of the systems themselves, is there, right? In a lot of ways, we've all embarked on these journeys, and we will all at some point have issues with data security, right? I mean, Estonia had your attacks in 2007. In Singapore, we had a massive cyber breach and exfiltration exercise on some of our healthcare records in 2018. And we learn from those, right? We learn in ways that have allowed us to make our data security systems better than they've been before. But I think data security and the occurrence of breaches, the ability to respond to those breaches quickly, that is a major way in which we should evaluate the success of our systems as well.
Would you have anything to add, Neil?
Sure. Feels a bit like preaching to the choir with my panel colleagues. I think whilst measurement of digitization and success started as a sort of efficiency driver, I agree with a lot of what's being said around, how do we measure sort of user satisfaction? Talking with my leadership team colleagues this morning, we're talking about coming up with metrics for the next phase. On gov.uk, we've got a 98% brand recognition, and obviously wanted to be a trusted source. We get a lot of traffic each week as well. So actually coming up with a broad and balanced kind of range of metrics is key, really, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, everyone. I think the main keywords that really caught my ear today was people, consistency, security, and yeah, we just have to focus and I think keep going forward. But now, before I give the floor to Erika, let's take a look at the next introduction video to her panel discussion.